Hello, everyone. My name is Lex Sloan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Roxy Theater here in San Francisco. I am so glad you all could join us tonight for a Q&A with Cara Jones, Director of Blessed Child, now streaming at the Roxy Virtual Cinema. We'll invite you to ask any questions for Cara by typing them into the chat box in YouTube. And tonight, the moderator for this conversation is the amazing Josh Alexander. Just a few words about Josh. Josh is an accomplished director, writer, and producer, and also born and raised in the Bay Area. Josh is one of the founders of Group Effort Films, and some of his recent films include writing Oscilloscope's J Myself, writing and producing Cinema Guild's I'm Leaving Now, and executive producing HBO Doc's United Skates. Other credits include script consulting work on Petra Costa's Netflix original, The Edge of Democracy, and writing and producing Sarah Jessica Parker's executive produced Pretty Old, among many others. In the fiction world, Josh EP'd the Alan Bates film Sins of a Father and wrote and produced Backseat. His films have played at film festivals including Sundance, Tribeca, Hot Docs, Doc NYC, Full Frame, Morelia, among many others, and have been acquired and licensed by distributors, broadcasters, and streamers, including HBO, CNN, Oscilloscope, the Cinema Guild, Gravitas, Hulu, and Netflix. His films have been nominated for the Oscars, the Peabody Awards, the IDAs, the Gothams, and among many others. So we're very excited to have Josh here in conversation with Cara. Thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. And without further ado, I will pass the mic to Josh.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Lex. I would also add that probably my most important part of my bio is I'm the son of a psychologist and a psychiatrist from the Bay Area. Let me bring on Cara immediately, right, as well. Can we bring Cara on? There's Cara Jones. Hello, Cara Jones.
Hello.
First of all, I think both of us want to just extend our thanks to the Roxy. It's been a very unique, and we can talk about this later, process of releasing a film. I also co-produced and wrote this film with Cara, so I will not pretend to be an objective party, but I'll try to have a bit of beginner's mind as I ask Cara some questions here. But it's been unique to premiere a film during the pandemic, and we just feel so deeply grateful to have found the very welcoming arms of the virtual cinema at the Roxy. And the film is also available on iTunes, Amazon, and Google as well. Let's turn to some questions and answers. Cara, how are you, first of all?
I'm doing great.
I guess I would start by saying, I think for anyone on this Zoom Q&A who has seen the film, we know that this film came out of a story that you developed for The Moth on your experience growing up in the Unification Church. I'm curious a little bit about how it went from being a Moth story to becoming a film. What started this into being a documentary?
So it was going to be a film before The Moth story happened, but it didn't know what film it wanted to be, I think would be the way to phrase it. I actually officially began the journey back in 2012 when Reverend Moon, the founder of the Unification Church, passed away. I was at Burning Man at the time, in a very different world than I was raised in, and I got the news as I was driving out among this caravan of dusty cars that he had passed away, and I just had this strong sense like, now's the time to tell the story. And so upon my return from Burning Man, got a friend, Ted Allen, to come with me to Korea to film the funeral. It was just this feeling that if I was going to tell the story, now was the time. Something was happening, history was happening as it related to the film. And so I went not knowing what story I was going to tell, and actually spent a few years interviewing all kinds of people, not sure exactly what story I was going to tell. And I had been trying to figure out what my story was about in the midst of all of this. And my friend and a story coach who had worked with me, Heather Box, shout out to Heather, had dropped me an email at one point and said, the Moth has this event coming up. The title of the event is Do Over. Go and tell your story. And so I had 48 hours to decide if I was going to do this. I hadn't publicly told the story in any way before. And so I showed up there that night and told the story. And through those 48 hours, actually just figured out more clearly what I wanted to say through the story. And that helped bring the film together. That was some of what helped bring the film together. As you know, there were other dimensions of that journey that would continue.
Yeah, I guess that would roll right into my second question would be, you know, when you, and this is a big question, so feel free to answer it shortly or bigly. But when you, what did you think the film was going to be when you started out? What did you set out to do? And how did it change in the process of making it?
Yeah, so when I was at the funeral, I started doing interviews with other second generation who were raised in the church, who happened to be there. And so these would be second generation that were still connected to the church. And then when I got back, my brother Bo and I went around the country and started interviewing others who had left and trying to capture their stories. And so I was hoping to tell everyone's story, right? Those who had it really hard, like much harder than I did, and those who were still in, and try to pick a few characters, both in and out, to follow their journey. And what started to become clear as we started getting into that process was that the only story that I had more access to was my own, to tell with more depth. And truthfully, as I started popping back into these environments, it also became clear to me that I wasn't as out of the church as I thought that I was. Not so much religiously, but in terms of my family's connections and sort of the community vibe, the sense of community that I cherished when I was younger. I found myself, at a few different points in the journey of revisiting some of these environments, feeling a pull again. And so that was also became something for me to look at, like, maybe I haven't left the church. and so that, I mean, I imagine most of the people who are listening maybe have watched the film, so hopefully this doesn't give it away. But there was something in particular about seeing my dad on a stage in the middle of a modern day mass wedding that really shook me and made me discover that I hadn't fully resolved what I needed to resolve with my own parents. And that became where the story wasn't just personal, but became more of a healing journey that I needed to go on for myself in this, surprisingly.
And you were generous to take an audience along with you. I guess that will roll into my next question, which is, one of the things that really attracted me to working on this film with you is that even though this very unique upbringing that you had, very religious, very unique, was in some ways a hook for the story to pull us in. It's really a story about a family. And it's really a story about how, as one becomes an adult, all of us have to reconcile or work with or integrate or understand who our parents are as opposed to who maybe we wish they would have been or would be. I think that one of the things that's so beautiful for me about this film is this very close relationship that you still have with your family, which also probably made it quite difficult to separate from them, especially if they remained in the church. And I guess my question would be a little bit about those interviews. You know, what was it like doing those interviews with your family? Did you know that you were going to do them? What was the experience like? How did you prepare yourself? What was that process like?
Yeah, well, there was a journey with the interviews, as there was with this whole film. You know, if I had known when I started that it would take 7 years, I don't think I would have ever said yes to it. But, you know, when I started, I had figured that, you know, my story would be a piece of the overall picture. And I remember asking my parents, you know, to sit down and just tell me their history, and so that I could include bits and pieces. And it was, for the most part, a pretty lighthearted, like, just tell me about how you joined and how you met. And it was, you know, it was also, I had some experience interviewing people in the line of my work. So it was a little bit jarring at first to be interviewing my parents, right? I remember one of the first times I interviewed them, I actually broke out crying before I even asked a question, which people who know me would not be surprised by. But so again, as I started to realize that there was some unresolved things with my parents, and as we were trying to figure out what the story was, it became clear to me that I needed to be more direct in asking some more difficult questions. And so I needed to develop a courage muscle to do that. That wasn't an overnight thing. And I spent many sleepless nights just worrying about what I was doing, why I was doing it, like, would we ever make it through this process? And oftentimes, so these interviews took place over several years, and oftentimes the only time I could get my parents in the same room and my family in the same space was on family vacations. So like, in the middle of, you know, the one time a year that my family's trying to come together from all over the world, I would have to, you know, take an afternoon or a day once to say, like, can everyone just stop and, you know, ask, like, talk to me about some really hard questions. So it was really hard. I didn't enjoy it, actually, but I had this deep sense of call about it. And my parents were more open. The more courage I got to ask harder questions, the more surprised I was at for the most part, well, you know, behind the scenes, there was a fair amount of discomfort at times. There was a willingness there that made it all possible. So, and I think there's behind the scenes, or sort of the layer underneath these interviews, was what I discovered was someone who is trying to separate from my mom and dad, which, like, even in my 40s, I'm now 45, I finished the film, or finished the interviews, I guess 2 years ago now, was surprisingly hard to, and so for me to ask those questions was a way of making that separation, of speaking truth that I wasn't able to speak most of my life. And for whatever reason, I needed a film to do that with. Hopefully most of you can, like, maybe be inspired to do it, and, you know, sit at Christmas dinner and do it that way. But there was something about having the film that provided a container of accountability for myself and them, in a way that the words that were spoken in that container felt more powerful and healing in a way than they would have if we just talked about it on a drive somewhere.
You know, one of the things I've talked about with some people that have watched the film recently is that the film is less about reconciliation than maybe repair. And so I guess I'm curious, did the answers your parents gave you give you a kind of repair that you needed? Did it not? Was it the process that did? How is your relationship with your parents and your family now?
I think what it brought was honesty. That was there to some degree, but there was another layer of it that wasn't in the way I interacted with them before this film. And that honesty is its own kind of repair, right? Truth provides its own kind of repair. And for me, the making of the film, the telling of the story, the asking of the questions was me being honest. And by holding space for them to be honest too, I got to get to know them on a deeper level and understand that in a more concrete way, that they're not changing their minds at this time in their life, right? They're not leaving the church. And I think this film helped me get more honest about that. Like, this is who they are. And as much as they've become much more open-minded through their children, right? That my dad used to joke that his children have turned him from like a fundamentalist Moonie to a liberal, right? Just because of various struggles, even beyond the scope of the film, that they've had to face as a result of the choices of their children. And so while I wish in some ways we could share the same beliefs, because in the past that was what kept us close. I think what I discovered through the making of this film is that by being more truthful, we could cultivate a relationship that was based on truth and not a belief system. And that felt healing and repairing.
That's great. It's actually nice to hear that. It's interesting for me. I mean, we worked on this film together for 1.5 years, so it's interesting to have some of these conversations with you now, because I don't think we actually even have, and to see that you're actually in quite a different place than you were at various moments that we were working on this. So it's really nice. Yeah. Let's move to some questions. I can call you any day, so and ask you whatever I want. So this is from Abby Rosen. What level of involvement do each of your brothers have in the religion at this point? And have any of them left the religion other than Bo?
Yeah, this is a question that we didn't have time to get into in depth in the film, and it could be its own documentary to sort of follow the trail, because it's not it's a hard thing to sum up. So my older brother, Matt, was married at the same time that I was. And so while my marriage didn't work, his did. And he and his wife have been married since 1995. So 25 years now. And have 6 children. And they live in Seoul. And for their family, the church is still a part of their family. I asked my brother recently, "Are you a member or are you not?" And he, as I recall, he said something like, I believe in some of the values and it supported my family. So to that extent, I'm a member, but he's not, I would say, a diehard believer in the church, but he's, of all of us, the closest to it, and occasionally attending events where they live in Seoul. My brother Harv, more private. So, but long story short, he's not in the church, nor is Bo, nor is my younger brother Farley. While we all maintain connections with people that we knew in the church, and occasionally, there's not this sort of like I'm out and I'm never going to talk to anyone from the church ever again attitude that any of us have. But religiously, there's only one of us who's actually still involved to some capacity.
This is a question from Lane Cohen, who is a fellow blessed child here, she says, or he says, I'm not sure. Cara, thanks to you and Bo for all your incredible work in putting your story and ours to the page. How did each of your family members react to the finished work?
Yeah, well, I think my brothers have always been supportive. You know, I think Bo was very courageous in this film and shared his story to the extent that he was comfortable, and a little bit more than he was comfortable, truthfully. But he obviously has been involved in the process. But all of my brothers have been supportive, and so their response was supportive. While I was still a little bit nervous about some of their responses, they were supportive. I think the hardest one for me was my parents. So I had worked on this film for years and years and done all these interviews and not showed them a cut the whole way. And so there was this trust that they placed with me to tell the story. And truthfully, with the footage we had, this could have gone any way in the edit. We could have told a very different story. So I actually prepared a whole speech for my parents before they watched the film about, you know, all the struggles that I had, because I didn't even talk to them so much about like what I was experiencing until the end. And I shared it with them, and I knew I wasn't going to sleep the whole night if I didn't hear from the next day. So I said, like, let's talk in a few hours after you're done. And I went to a yoga class. Like, I sent to Phil, I'm like, gotta go to yoga. And I came, and so my parents said they were going to call me like much later in the day, and they wanted some time to process it. And they left me a voicemail when I was in the yoga class, and they were all like emotional and just said, we support you, and we think it's beautiful, and it's hard to watch, and not without us feeling uncomfortable at times, but basically we support you. And I saved that message so I can replay it to myself a few times.
I'd call that some repair, I think.
Yeah.
Emily Shaw asks, what was your North Star when going through lots and lots of tape? Did you ever feel like you were losing perspective on the tape and the story?
Great question.
And actually, I'm going to add Julie's question into that because it's similar. Can you share a little bit about how you found or decided what the narrative arc of the story would be from the immensity of all this footage and life experience?
Yeah. So once I decided it was going to be a personal story, and I had the moth footage actually to help craft that, I had a sense of what the beginning and end was going to be, but the middle was just all over the place. And I also hadn't done a few key interviews. So before I even get into this, I also want to acknowledge, just in case I don't have any chance to do it again, that this film was a total team effort. And I know that you don't know these people, but I'm just gonna like name the people who were involved in this journey, because it's actually part of the answering of this question around like how it came together. So Chelsea Matter, I met in a coffee shop through our friend Dawn Hardy like 8 years ago, and I told her this story, and she just latched onto it and was like, I'm gonna help you do this. She's a producer, and through 7 years and 3 children and lots of ups and downs in her own life, she never let it go. And there were times when I felt like really alone in this process, and it meant so much to me to have her support. And sorry. Jean Kawahara, who was our editor. So related to this narrative arc, we sat and we crafted a story with, you know, a pretty strong beginning and an end. And Jean is an amazing storyteller as well. I joke that she became like a documentary therapist. So I was like working on all this stuff as we're trying to figure out. I did a whole, after I did The Moth, I did a whole solo performance workshop. Julie, you know what this is all about, to try to act out this story. And there were like a cut of the film that involved my acting out parts of the story that is really embarrassing to think about now. I had Naomi Turi come on board, and she helped film. Once we realized this was needing to be a more intimate story, she helped film some of these key intimate moments, including the what was I going to say? Oh, the conversations with my parents that were part of the ending. She was huge in that. Daniel Chalfin, who like believed in this story. We pitched it at a Doc NYC event, and he just saw something in it at a point where we had almost given up hope that it was ever going to become anything. Most documentary filmmakers, first-time documentary filmmakers, don't finish their first film, and we were almost in that graveyard. And so, yeah, obviously my brother Bo was very involved too, especially in the beginning. And we had, you know, a handful of photographers that got involved in shooting various scenes. And Josh, you came in at a point where we were like, we had all the materials, and I was trying to like make it more interesting, right, through my performed storytelling, like bringing more drama into it. And you came along and could see the story that was already in the footage, and helped me. I'll never forget, there was one day that we worked together, and I was like driving home, and I was like bawling. I'm like, it's fine. It's like finally coming together. But you just helped me see what was already there. And I tell this because I now help other people with their stories. This is what I do now, but it's really hard to see it for yourself, especially when it's so personal and emotional. And so it took a team to see the story, to execute the story, and to draw out the story that was already there, right? I kept thinking that the story wasn't dramatic enough to hold a feature-length film. And in the end, you know, I came back to the beginning, middle, and end of what actually happened in my life. And that's what brought the film together, with the support of Josh and this team. So.
Thank you. This is a question from Chris Seidel. Cara, do you feel like you will forever have an identity as a blessed child, or do you believe you are recreating a completely new identity now of your own choosing after making this film?
I mean, Josh called me a blessed child right before we got on the call. So it's like, it's interesting. And actually, the film used to be called Second Coming, which is, you know, inspired by the idea that Reverend Moon thought he was a second coming, and this film is sort of a second coming story. So when we decided to name it with Josh's inspiration, Blessed Child, it caused me to think about this identity more than I have ever thought about before. And hey, I mean, I think we're all blessed children, people. So I don't, I think I had this identity growing up that was based on me being a shade holier than the rest of humanity, right? Born without original sin. And so it was built on this lie, right? That's not true, in my opinion, now where I stand. And so I rejected that entire identity. And I rejected parts of myself as a result of that when I left. And I think the making of this film has helped me integrate some of my idealism and goodness that was mine, that was not about being a blessed child, right? But just part of who I was, in a way that I'm really happy about and proud about. And so, yes, I am still a blessed child, and so are you, and so are all of us. And I think these identities can become more powerful and real when we invite them back into our adult perspectives.
I think you just answered this question, but I want to give a shout out to Sarita Chawla, who asked this, because she said, I really like how she worded this: dear, dear Cara, in this moment, what is your heart and soul awakening and opening to? And I think that you just kind of talked about that a little bit. Here's a question from, I think it's Monsoon or Monsoon. Did you have to get the permission from the church to use a lot of the church footage? Was that difficult to work out with them? Is your question, or his question.
So we did have to get permission from the church, not just to use the footage, but to go back into some of these modern day events, which was part of what I wanted to do. Initially, we got a no, and that was heartbreaking for me. There was a different leadership in place, and I remember hearing something about like not wanting it to be like a liberal pro-gay film made by California filmmakers. And I was like so pissed. Okay, so there's that. And then there was a change in leadership. And I found out when the new church president was going to be in the Bay Area, and I sat down with him and had a heart-to-heart with him about the fact that I wanted to tell an honest story. And I didn't see examples out in the world of something that was not propaganda, right? Like the church had made a lot of their own documentaries that were very propaganda-like, and something that was not a complete slam job on the church, which is what most of the outside media about it has been all about. And I said, I think this is an opportunity to tell a more honest story. And I knew that I wanted to tell a story that would have some kind of positive healing outcome. And I think to this leader's credit, he said, well, first of all, it can't be any worse than what's already out there. And secondly, if it's about healing, and you know, he was well aware of a lot of the healing that was needing to happen between parents and children who had left, then, you know, that was something that they would support. And so we worked together, and for the most part, other than having to deal with like some tough attorney clearances on some of the footage, it was a pretty easeful process. I haven't heard any response from the church yet on.
I was going to ask, do you know if church leadership has or hasn't seen it yet?
I haven't heard that yet. It's, you know, pretty recent that nobody that I know of. I've had people from the church come to our premiere in November, and while some of them had a hard time with it, there was a pretty universal sense that it was at least fair. And so far, I haven't heard anything from actual church leadership. I hope to in the coming weeks.
Not a question, but a sweet note. This is from Crystal Gunterman. Cara, thank you for sharing your story. It was really healing to watch with my sisters. I couldn't help but think you portrayed the first generation with so much respect and empathy. Our generation has endured so much trauma. And while part of me craves some narrative arc of justice, quote unquote, I'm ultimately grateful you made something that I feel hopeful to share and discuss with my parents. And Lisa Lay said, the moment your dad says you are more important to him than the church, what was that like for you?
I mean, this was the beauty of the film, right? Where if he had said that over Christmas dinner, I don't know if I could have really taken it in. And I took it in to some extent in the moment, but it wasn't until I watched it later that I really felt it. And I think even though I knew my dad loved me, given that earlier in my life, you know, I had a fair amount of conflict with my parents over the church. There was a healing of my whole life that happened with those words. And a replay that I needed to hear in the making of this film that I think has allowed them to land more deeply. And it's not just those words, but it's their when we were going to the premiere, I remember going up the escalator with my dad, and you know, I could feel he was nervous. Right? Like, we're about to go to this premiere, and like he's gonna watch his story in this particular light, played in a movie theater with 100 strangers, and he looked at me. He's like, "Don't worry about us. This is your time." And so those words and that attitude towards me was, I think, something that I was waiting for my whole life to hear.
So I think this is going to be our last question. This is from Kiyomi Kobayashi. How hard was it to tell your story truthfully when you knew your parents opposed your views? Do you think the direction of the film would have been different if you hadn't included them in it?
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, like I said, a lot of sleepless nights over this film. And like those mean voices that were like, your parents are in their 70s, they're almost 80. You're gonna do this to them at the end of their life. So yeah, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I've shared this before, but I really almost dropped it a few times because of this. I remember there was somebody that was going to come on as a co-director of the film who wanted to tell more of the sensational angle alongside my family story. So it was going to be balanced, but a little more on the sensational side. And he came and filmed my wedding, which actually, you know, chronologically happened before those final interviews. And he was at the wedding and he was like, I can't do this. Your parents are too nice. I just can't do it. And so he just decided, like, you got to tell this story. I can't do this. And at that point I was like, I don't think I can do it. Like, it's just too hard. Like, I'm happy. Maybe I don't need to rock the boat anymore, but the call just wouldn't let me do that. And this film wouldn't have been a film, or not one that I wanted to make, honestly, without my parents. I didn't know that when I started, but it couldn't have been made without my parents. And I believe it's a story that wanted to be told. I can only explain, like, all the signs that I saw along the journey, and, you know, people who came in at desperate moments, that, like, the universe, you're right, I'm still a spiritual person despite not having a religion, that the universe was supporting this, and the story wanted to be told. And it's been interesting since releasing the film. You know, some people love it, and, you know, some of the critics have had, like, you know, some negative things to say. And I've been able to look at myself and even my parents as archetypes of sorts, right? And realize the way that people are watching and projecting, you know, their experience on us, right? So, and I'm glad for that, right? Like, it's not often that you see films that are so intimately about the family and the parent-child relationship. And I think I hope that it can be a contribution in that way. Because it truly felt like there was in the end, that there was no other way to tell it than the way that it was told.
Well, I'm very glad that you did choose to tell it and that you did stick with it. I feel very much like a blessed child to have gotten to work on it. And I want to thank our audience tonight. We really, really deeply appreciate everyone tuning in. This is a small independent documentary film, like so many documentaries are. We feel very lucky to be in release during this pandemic. And for many of you who are at home with families and sheltering and struggling through a lot of familial time at these moments, or for those of you who are separated from families, it seems like a great moment to watch this film or to share this film with people that you think might get something from it or enjoy it. And we'd appreciate it. So thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to the Roxy. And that's it. Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank
Cara.
you, everyone.